Scene 2,
The year was
sun rising
1457.
behind Mount
The location was a
Tumanichta.
rugged,
Scene
dusty
3,
plain in the heart of
dry
Albania,
wind
overshadowed by
sweeping
the imposing
plain.
silhouette
Scene
of Mount
4,
Tumanichta.
dust drifting across
The air was thick with the
Albulena.
heat of late summer,
Scene 5,
a stifling
Ottoman
humidity that clung
banners
to the
in
skin
distance.
and slowed the breath.
Scene 6,
Below,
endless
sprawled
rows
across the
of
valley of
tents.
Albulena,
Scene
lay a
7,
sight that would have
soldiers
frozen the blood of
marching
any
in
monarch in
formation.
Europe. It was
Scene
the
8,
Imperial Ottoman army,
Janissaries
a
drilling.
force of nature
Scene 9,
that had recently
Sepahih
shattered the walls of
cavalry riding
Constantinople
past.
and brought the
Scene
thousand-year
10,
Byzantine
close-up
Empire
of
to its
Ottoman
knees.
steel.
They were
Scene
80,000
11,
strong.
Ottoman camp
They were the apex
expanding.
predators of the medieval
Scene
world,
12,
a
supply
war machine
wagons
refined by
rolling
centuries
in.
of conquest,
Scene 13,
equipped with the
artillery
finest steel,
positioned.
the most
Scene
disciplined
14,
infantry, and the
commanders
most feared
studying
cavalry
maps.
on earth.
Scene
They had come to
15,
this corner of the
confident
Balkans with a
Ottoman
singular
faces.
purpose,
Scene
to finally
16,
crush a rebellion
campfires
that had
at
become a
night.
humiliating
Scene
thorn in the
17,
side of the
guards
Sultan.
posted
Opposing
lazily.
this tidal wave
Scene
of iron
18,
and fire was a
soldiers
force that,
laughing.
on
Scene
paper,
19,
ceased to be a
heat
military
shimmering
unit
at
and looked
noon.
more like a
Scene
desperate
20,
suicide
camp
pact.
fully settled.
Hidden in the forests
Scene
and the craggy
21,
recesses of the
Albanian
mountain were
forests
roughly 8,000
silent.
men.
Scene 22,
They were not an
narrow
imperial
mountain
legion.
paths.
Many
Scene
were not professional
23,
soldiers in
hidden
the traditional
watchful
sense.
eyes.
They were a
Scene
mixture of hardened
24,
guerrilla
Skanderbeg
fighters, local
observing
farmers,
below.
mountaineers,
Scene
and a corps of
25,
cavalry veterans.
Albanian
They
fighters
were outnumbered 10
concealed.
to
Scene
1.
26,
By all
men
conventional
gripping
logic of
worn
warfare, the
weapons.
battle was already
Scene
over before it had
27,
begun.
no
The
fires
math
lit.
was impossible.
Scene
The
28,
logistics were
absolute
hopeless.
silence.
The inevitable result should have been a
29,
massacre
waiting
that
in
wiped the
shadows.
Albanian
Scene
resistance from the
30,
pages
time
of history.
passing. Scene
But
31,
history is not
Ottoman
always written by the
patrols.
sheer
Slow.
weight of
Scene
numbers.
32, soldiers
Sometimes
removing
it is written by
armor.
the audacity
Scene
of a single
33,
mind.
gambling in
Leading this
tents.
small
Scene
band of
34,
defenders
horses
was a man whose
grazing
name had
freely.
become a curse word in
Scene
the Ottoman
35,
court,
officers
and a prayer
resting.
in the
Scene
cathedrals of Rome.
36, camp
George
discipline
Castriot,
weakening.
known to the
Scene
world as
37, heat
Skanderbeg.
exhaustion.
What
Scene
happened next on
38,
that sweltering September
overconfidence
day was
spreading.
not just a battle. It was a
Scene
masterclass
39,
in psychological
flags hanging
warfare,
limp.
a miracle
Scene
of
40,
tactics,
midday
and one of the most
calm.
lopsided
Scene
victories in the
41,
history of human
Skanderbeg
conflict.
signals
It was the day a
silencing.
small army of
42,
defenders did not
Albanian
just
men
survive
kneeling.
against an
Scene
empire,
43,
they shattered it.
whispered
To
orders.
truly understand
Scene
the gravity of the
44,
Battle of
dividing
Albulena,
into groups.
we must first
Scene
understand the
45,
shadow that
checking
loomed over
weapons
Europe in the
quietly. Scene
mid-15th century.
46,
This was an
faces
era of
tense. Scene
existential dread for the
47,
Christian West.
final
In
preparations. Scene
1453,
48,
just 4
waiting
years
for
prior to
signal.
the events
Scene
at
49,
Albulena,
noon
Sultan
sun
Mehmed
overhead.
II,
Scene
known as
50,
the Conqueror,
absolute
had done the
stillness.
impossible.
Scene
He
51,
had breached the
war horn
Theodosian
blasts.
walls and taken
Scene 52,
Constantinople.
drums
The
erupt.
psychological
Scene
shockwave of this event
53,
cannot be
battle
overstated.
cries echo.
If the heir to Rome could fall,
Scene
nothing was
54,
safe.
Ottomans
The Ottoman war
startled
machine
awake.
seemed unstoppable,
Scene 55,
a juggernaut that was
confused
destined to sweep
soldiers
all the way to the
scrambling.
Atlantic. The
Scene
Ottoman army was
56,
not merely a
Albanian
large mob
cavalry
of armed
charging.
men.
Scene
It was a
57,
highly complex,
tents collapsing.
professionalized
Scene
institution.
58,
At its
supply
core were the
wagons
Janissaries,
overturned.
elite shock
Scene
troops taken as
59,
children and
fires
raised with
breaking
fanatical
out.
loyalty to the
Scene
Sultan,
60,
trained in the
panic
arts of war
spreads.
until they
Scene
were arguably
61,
the finest
Ottomans
infantry in the
running
world.
unarmored.
Flanking
Scene
them
62,
were the Sepahis,
Albanian
the armored
infantry
cavalry
swarming.
who held land
Scene
grants in
63,
exchange for
command
military
posts
service.
attacked.
Driven
Scene
by the promise of
64,
plunder
orders
and glory,
unheard.
they
Scene
possessed
65,
artillery,
dust,
logistics corps,
clouds rising.
and a command
Scene
structure that was
66,
centuries ahead of many
horses
European
panicking.
feudal levies.
Scene 67,
Standing in the path of
screams
this juggernaut
everywhere.
was Albania,
Scene 68,
a
broken
small,
formations.
mountainous region that
Scene
served as the
69,
gateway to the
Janissaries
Italian peninsula.
overwhelmed. Scene
If
70,
Albania fell,
camp
the Adriatic Sea would become an
Scene
Ottoman lake,
71,
and Rome
Skanderbeg.
itself would be within
Charging
striking
forward.
distance.
Scene 72,
The man standing at
sword
the gate
raised
was
high.
Skanderbeg.
Scene 73,
His story
enemies
is one of the most
falling
fascinating
back.
arcs in military
Scene
history,
74,
for he was a
Albanian
product of the
morale
very empire he
surging.
fought.
Scene 75,
Taken hostage
Ottoman
as a child,
officers
he was
shouting.
raised in the Ottoman
Scene
court,
76,
trained in their military
no
academies,
lines forming.
and
Scene
rose to the rank of
77,
general.
numbers
He knew their
becoming
tactics,
chaos.
their language,
Scene
their
78,
mindset,
soldiers
and their weaknesses
trampling
better than any
each
Western
other.
commander.
Scene
He had fought for
79,
the Sultan,
dust
earning the
blinding
title
vision.
Iskender Bey, or Lord
Scene
Alexander,
80, total
comparing his prowess
confusion.
to Alexander
Scene
the Great.
81, Hamza
When he defected and returned to his
spotted.
homeland
Scene
to lead the
82,
rebellion,
surrounded.
he brought with him the
By
intellect of an
Albania.
Ottoman
Scene
general and the heart of an
83,
Albanian
attempted
patriot.
escape. Scene
For over a
84,
decade, he had
cut-off
utilized
scene.
the rugged terrain of his
85,
country to bleed
forced
the Ottomans
to surrender.
dry,
Scene
using
86,
hit-and-run tactics
captured
that frustrated
alive.
army after
Scene
army.
87,
But by
Albanian victory
1457,
cry.
the situation
Scene
had changed.
88,
The Sultan was
Ottoman
tired of the
morale
skirmishes.
collapsing.
He wanted a
Scene
final
89,
solution.
commands.
he dispatched
Broken
an army of
scene
80,000 men,
90.
a force
Retreat
so large it was
begins.
intended to
Scene
simply
91.
suffocate the rebellion
Isaac
by its mere
Beg.
presence.
Fleeing. Scene
However,
92.
the true danger of this
Abandoned
invasion force
artillery.
was not
Scene
just its size,
93.
it was its
Gold
leadership.
left behind.
The Ottoman army was commanded
Scene
by Isaac Beg,
94.
a
Broken
seasoned
columns.
veteran,
Retreating.
but his second in
Scene
command
95.
was the true threat.
Albanian pursuit.
It was Hamza
Scene
Castrioti,
96.
Skanderbeg's own
Stragglers
nephew.
cut down.
Hamza
Scene
had defected to the
97.
Ottomans, driven by
Panic on the
jealousy and
roads.
ambition.
Scene 98.
This was a catastrophic
Retreat
blow to
turning
the
route.
resistance.
Scene
Hamza had fought by
99.
Skanderbeg's
Survivors
side for
fleeing
years.
valley.
He knew the
Scene
terrain,
100.
he knew the secret
Silence
paths, he
returning.
knew the guerrilla tactics.
101.
Most importantly, he knew
Battlefield
Skanderbeg's mind.
aftermaths. Scene
The
102. Fallen
now
weapons
had the one thing they
everywhere.
had lacked for
Scene
decades,
103.
the code to
Ottoman
decipher
banners
Skanderbeg's
torn.
strategy.
Scene
As the massive
104.
Ottoman
Burned
force crossed
tents.
into Albania,
Scene
the
105.
mood in the country was one
Wounded
of
soldiers
apocalyptic fear.
groaning.
Villages
Scene
were abandoned.
106.
The smoke of burning
Albanian
homesteads
dead.
choked the
Few.
valleys.
Scene 107.
The people looked to their leader for
Prisoners
salvation,
gathered. Scene
but
108.
Skanderbeg did something that
Captured
baffled
supplies.
both his allies and his
Counted.
enemies.
Scene 109.
He disappeared.
Horses reclaimed.
This was the first
Scene
stroke of genius in a campaign
110.
defined by
Victory.
deception.
Settling in. Scene
Skanderbeg knew that he could not meet
111.
80,000 men
Albanian
in an open field.
Embracing.
It would be
Scene
suicide.
112.
He also knew that
Skanderbeg
Hamza would
surveying
expect the
field.
standard guerrilla harassment,
Scene 113.
ambushes in the mountain passes,
Smoke
night
drifting
raids on
upward.
supply lines.
Scene
If Skanderbeg fought the way he
114.
usually
Sun
fought,
lowering.
Hamza would
Scene
counter him.
115.
So Skanderbeg
Silence
chose to do
heavy.
nothing.
Scene
He took his small
116.
force of
Victory
8,000 men
confirmed.
and vanished into the
Scene
deepest forests and highest
117.
peaks.
Messengers
He strictly
departing.
forbade his
Scene
men from engaging the enemy.
118. News
Not a single
spreading.
arrow was to be
Scene
loosed.
119.
Not a single scout was
Roads
to be
to
seen.
Europe. Scene
To the outside world, it looked as if the
Rome
rebellion had
alerted.
finally
Scene
collapsed.
121.
Skanderbeg
Church.
spread rumors through
Bells ringing.
spies and
Scene
double agents
122.
that he had been
Pope
betrayed by his
celebrating.
troops,
Scene
that he had fled to
123.
Italy, or that he had
Skanderbeg
died of despair.
praised. Scene
He allowed the narrative of his own
124.
defeat to
Europe
take root.
relieved. Scene
The Vatican was in a panic,
125.
believing the last
Ottoman
shield of
court
Christendom had
furious.
shattered.
Scene
The Ottoman commanders,
126.
hearing these
Sultan
reports and
hearing
seeing no
news.
resistance,
Scene
began to believe that the
127.
war was
Shocked
over.
reaction.
The Ottoman
Scene
army advanced deep into
128.
Albanian
Plans
territory,
delayed.
unopposed. They
Scene
reached the plain of Albulena,
129.
a strategic
Albania
location
still
near the
free.
town of Milo.
Scene
Finding no enemy
130.
to fight,
Time
they set up a
gained.
massive
Scene
encampment. Weeks turned into
131.
months.
Hamza
The
imprisoned.
summer sun beat
Scene
down on the valley.
132.
The strict discipline that usually
Ambition
defined the Ottoman
ended.
army
Scene
began to erode.
133.
Why?
Betrayal
Maintain
punished.
a war footing when
Scene
the enemy has fled.
134.
Why keep watch when the
Albanian
ghost of
unity
Skanderbeg was
strengthened.
rumored to be
Scene
hiding in Rome?
135.
Hamza
Mountains.
Castrioti, usually
Standing
sharp and
firm.
suspicious,
Scene
eventually succumbed to the
136.
complacency.
Villages returning.
He wanted to be
Scene
the ruler of Albania,
137.
and he believed his uncle
Fires
was finished.
rebuilt. Scene
The soldiers began
138.
to relax.
People celebrating.
They shed their heavy armor
Scene
to escape the heat.
139. Songs
They spent their
of
days
victory.
resting, gambling,
Scene
and celebrating their
140.
bloodless
Legend
conquest.
growing.
The camp
Scene
guards became lax.
141.
The patrols became
Skanderbeg.
infrequent and
Remembered.
perfunctory.
Scene
By the beginning of
142.
September,
Soldiers
the Ottoman camp at
resting.
Albulena was not a military
Scene
formation ready for battle.
143.
It was a city of
Weapons
80,000
cleaned.
souls waiting
Scene
for the order to march home in
144.
triumph.
Camps
But high above them,
dismantled.
in the dense
Scene
canopy of Mount Tumaninishta,
145.
eyes were watching.
Watchposts restored.
Skanderbeg
Scene
and his 8,000 men
146.
had been living in the
guards.
wild for
Alert
months,
again.
enduring hunger,
Scene
exposure, and the agonizing
147.
tension of waiting.
Future uncertain.
This required a level of
Scene
discipline that is almost
148.
unfathomable.
Resolve hardened.
To keep
Scene
8,000 men hidden, silent,
149.
and immobile,
Albania.
while an enemy army
Vigilant.
ravaged
Scene
their lands below
150.
required.
Mountains.
A leadership
Quiet
presence that
scene.
bordered on the divine.
151.
Skanderbeg
Sunset
held them there,
over
coiled like a viper,
Albulena.
waiting for
Scene
the perfect moment of
152.
maximum
Long
vulnerability.
shadows.
That
Scene
moment arrived on September
153.
2nd,
Battlefield
1457.
emptying.
It was
Scene
the height of the day.
154.
The sun
Wind
was at its
through
zenith,
grass.
turning
Scene
the plain of Albulena into a
155.
furnace. In
Blood-soaked
the Ottoman camp,
earth.
the activity
Scene
was at its lowest.
156.
Men were sleeping in their
History
tents to avoid the
written.
midday glare.
Scene
Officers were eating lunch.
157.
Horses were
Underdog
unsaddled and
triumph.
grazing.
Scene
The heat shimmered off the ground,
158.
blurring the
Empire
horizon.
humbled.
The silence of the
Scene
afternoon was heavy and lulling.
159. Strategy
Then,
victorious.
the world ended.
Scene
From the tree line of the surrounding
160.
hills,
Patience.
a sound erupted that was
Rewarded.
described by
Scene
chroniclers as the roaring of a
161.
sudden
Time
storm.
passes.
Skanderbeg had
Scene
divided his Sama,
162. Memory
LL
remains.
forced into 3 separate
Scene
groups to attack from different
163.
directions,
Stories
creating the
told.
auditory illusion of a
Listening.
massive
Scene
encircling army.
165.
Trumpets blared, drums
Skanderbeg's
thundered,
name
and thousands of men
spoken.
screamed their
Scene
battle cries in unison.
165.
Before the
Skanderbeg's
Ottoman
name
sentries could even
spoken.
process
Scene
the noise,
167.
the Albanian cavalry smashed
Freedom
into the camp.
preserved.
They did
Scene
not ride with the tentative caution of a
168.
probing force.
Borders Hain.
They rode with the fury of men who had been
169.
caged for
Europe
months.
breathing
They struck the
easier.
perimeter with the
Scene
force of a sledgehammer.
170. Legacy
The initial impact was
begins.
devastating.
Scene 171.
tents were trampled, supply wagons overturned, and the confused, unarmored Ottoman soldiers were cut down before they could reach for their weapons.
Scene 173
Chaos is the enemy of
Renaissance
command,
protected.
and Skanderbeg
Scene
weaponized chaos.
174
He knew that
Italy
80,000
spared.
men are only an
Scene
army if they can communicate,
175.
if they cannot hear
Faith
orders,
strengthened.
if they cannot
Scene
form lines.
176
They are just a mob.
warriors
By attacking at
remembered.
noon,
Scene
when the camp was most
177
disorganized,
farmers
and by attacking
become
from multiple
heroes.
sides,
Scene
he shattered the Ottoman chain of command
178
instantly.
mountains
Panic spread like a
immortalized.
contagion.
Scene
The sheer volume of the
179
noise and the ferocity of the
Albulena
assault
remembered.
convinced the
Scene
Ottomans that they were
180
facing a
history
force
pauses.
equal to their
Scene
own.
181
The rumors
wind
of
over
Skanderbeg's
valley.
flight,
Scene
the months of silence,
182 birds
it all collapsed in a
returning.
terrifying
Scene
realization they had been
183
baited.
grass regrowing.
The ghost was real,
Scene
and he was here.
184 scars
Hamza Castrioti
fading.
and Isak
Scene
Beg tried desperately to rally their
185
troops.
memory endures.
They shouted orders, tried to form
Scene
defensive squares, tried to get the
186
Janissaries into
learned.
position.
Scene
But the momentum was
187
entirely with the
mind over
Albanians.
force.
Skanderbeg
Scene
himself was at the tip of the
188
spear leading the
strategy
charge.
supreme. Scene
Historical accounts describe him as a
189
whirlwind,
discipline
cutting a
proven.
path through the
Scene
enemy ranks with a physical
190
strength that seemed
unity
superhuman.
wins. Scene
His
191
presence on the
Skanderbeg.
battlefield had a dual
Silhouette.
effect.
Scene
It terrified the
192
Ottomans,
sword
who
lowered.
viewed him
Scene
as a traitorous demon,
193
and it
armor.
electrified his
Scarred.
own men,
Scene
who saw him as an
194
invincible
eyes.
savior.
Calm.
The
Scene
tactical brilliance of the assault was in
195
its target
burden
selection.
carried. Scene
Skanderbeg did not just hack
196
mindlessly at the
victory
infantry,
without
he
arrogance.
targeted the command
Scene
centers and the reserves.
197
He denied the
watchful
Ottomans the time
stance.
to dress
Scene
in their armor.
198
A janissary without his
protector
formation
remains.
and without his
Scene
armor is mortal.
199
The Albanian light
Dragon
infantry,
of Albania.
agile and unburdened,
Scene
swarmed
200
through the camp,
standing firm.
using their knowledge of the terrain
Scene
to outmaneuver the
201
heavier, slower
clouds
Ottoman
drifting.
units.
Scene
The battle
202
rapidly devolved into a rout.
nightfalling. Scene
The Ottoman numbers, which
203
should have been their greatest
campfires lit
strength,
safely.
became
Scene
their greatest
204.
liability. In the
Guards
confined chaos of the
posted. Scene
camp,
205
80,000 men
peace
tripped over
earned.
one another,
Scene
blocking their own retreat,
206
preventing their
silence.
own cavalry from building momentum.
Respected. Scene
The dust kicked
207
up by the
future
struggle blinded them.
watched. Scene
The screams of the
208
wounded and the
threat.
dying drowned out the
Remembered.
officers.
Scene
It
209
was a slaughter.
strength renewed.
In the center
Scene
of the maelstrom,
210
Skanderbeg sought out the heart
Albania
of the betrayal.
endures. Scene
His forces closed in on
211
Hamza
time.
Castrioti.
Moves on.
The tragedy
Scene
of the family feud played
212
out amidst the blood and
empires
dust.
rise. Scene
Hamza, the man who wanted to be
213
king,
empires fall.
the man who had sold his country for a crown, found himself surrounded not by a defeated rabble, but by the very veterans he had once commanded. He was captured alive.
216
This was
courage
crucial for
remembered.
Skanderbeg. To
Scene
kill him would be simple
217
vengeance.
patience
To capture him was a
remembered.
political
Scene
masterstroke. It
218
proved that the rebellion
brilliance
was not just a
remembered.
nuisance,
Scene
but a sovereign power
219
capable of justice.
sacrifice honored. Scene
Isak Beg,
220
realizing
victory.
the day was lost, and
Eternal
that the army was
Scene
dissolving into panic,
221 valley
managed to
at
flee with a
peace.
portion of the
Scene
troops, leaving the baggage
222
train, the
mountains
artillery,
unmoved.
and thousands of
Scene
his men behind.
223
The retreat was
wind
harrowing.
whispers history.
The Albanian
Scene
forces pursued them,
224
harassing
earth remembers
He
blood.
broken columns,
Scene
ensuring that they did not
225
regroup.
silence speaks.
When the dust finally
Scene
settled over Albulena,
226
the scale of the
freedom
victory
breathes.
became clear.
Scene
The numbers were staggering.
227 watch
Depending on the
continues.
historical source,
Scene
between 15,000 and
228
30,000
shield
Ottoman
stands.
soldiers
Scene
lay dead or
229
wounded on the
border
field.
holds. Scene
Thousands more were taken
230
prisoner.
hope survives.
The entire baggage train of the Imperial
Scene
Army, gold,
231
weapons,
distant
supplies,
thunder
tents,
fades.
horses,
Scene
fell into Albanian
232
hands.
sunrises.
It was a transfer
again.
of wealth that
Scene
would fund the rebellion for years to
233
come.
New day dawns.
But the cost to the Albanians?
Scene
It was negligible.
234 Albania
They had lost
standing.
extremely few
Scene
men.
235
It was a victory of efficiency that
Skanderbeg
defied belief.
watching. Scene
With 8,000 farmers and
236
mountaineers,
enemy
Skanderbeg
wary.
had
Scene
dismantled the largest army the
237
Sultan had ever
legend
sent against him.
alive. Scene
The aftermath of Albulena
238
resonated far
name
beyond the
feared.
borders of
Scene
Albania.
239
Couriers rode day and
name
night to
honored.
bring the
Scene
news to the courts of Europe.
240 name
When the word reached
eternal.
Rome,
Scene
Pope Calixtus III
241
was
pages
euphoric.
turning.
The fear
Scene
that had gripped the Vatican
242
since the fall of
chroniclers
Constantinople was
writing.
temporarily
Scene
lifted.
243 ink
Skanderbeg
drying.
was named
Scene
Athletic Christi,
244
the champion of Christ.
Truth recorded.
He was appointed
Scene
Captain General of the Holy
245
See.
Mythborn.
The victory
Scene
proved that the Ottomans were
246
not
story
invincible.
spreading.
It proved
Scene
that strategy,
247
terrain, and
memory
morale could
fixed.
overcome sheer
Scene
industrial military
248
might.
lesson taught.
However,
Scene
the psychological impact on the
249
Ottoman Empire was
future
equally
inspired. Scene
profound.
250
The
past
Sultan,
secured.
Mehmed the
Scene
Conqueror, the man who had toppled
251
Byzantium,
valley quiet
was forced
again.
to accept that he
Scene
could not conquer this
252
jagged strip of
wind
land in the
soft.
Balkans.
Scene 253 grass
The
bending.
defeat at Albulena
Scene
bought Europe time.
255
It acted as a
mountains.
breakwater,
Still
slowing the
scene
Ottoman advance into
255
Italy and Central Europe for
Still
decades.
scene
Had Skanderbeg
256,
failed at
silence
Albulena,
deep.
had he been
Scene
crushed by the 80,000,
257,
there would have been no
fragile.
buffer.
Scene
The path to Rome would have
258,
been open.
watchful, calm.
The history,
scene 260,
the Renaissance
resolve,
of the
constant.
Catholic
Scene
Church
261,
and of Western Europe
shadows,
might have looked
lengthen.
radically different.
Scene 262,
We must also look at the fate of
light
Hamza
fades.
Castrioti.
Scene
He was sent to Naples as a prisoner,
night
a living
returns.
symbol of the consequences of treachery. He was not executed, but his ambitions were dead. He spent the rest of his days in obscurity, a footnote in the legend of his uncle. The genius of Albulena lay not in the fighting itself, but in the patience. It is a lesson that is still studied in military colleges today. Skanderbeg understood the principle of the indirect approach. He did not strike where the enemy was strong. He waited until they made themselves weak. He used time as a weapon. He understood that an army of 80,000 is a beast that needs to be fed, watered, and entertained. By denying them a battle, he forced them to rot from the inside out. He allowed boredom and arrogance to do the work that his sword could not. Furthermore, the battle highlights the incredible bond between Skanderbeg and his men. To convince 8,000 starving, outnumbered soldiers to hide in the woods and watch their enemy feast requires a level of trust that is rare in human history. They had to believe with absolute certainty that his plan would work. They had to trust that he wasn't abandoning them when he disappeared. This cohesion was the true secret weapon of the Albanian resistance. The Battle of Albulena stands as a testament to the power of asymmetric warfare. It is the ultimate underdog story, stripped of myth and laid bare in the cold facts of tactics. It shows us that war is not merely a contest of strength, but a contest of the mind. Skanderbeg outthought his opponents. He played on their psychology, their expectations, and their arrogance. He turned their greatest strength, their numbers, into their fatal flaw. In the grand tapestry of history, the Ottoman Empire would eventually continue its expansion. They would go on to besiege Vienna. They would dominate the Mediterranean. But for a brief, shining moment in the mid-15th century, in a dusty valley in Albania, the tide was held back. A group of farmers, led by a visionary general, stood their ground and shattered the invincible. As the sun set on that September day in 1457, the landscape of Albulena was changed forever. The silence that fell over the valley was not the silence of a sleepy afternoon, but the silence of the grave for thousands of invaders. For the Albanians, it was the sound of freedom, bought with patience, courage, and the brilliance of the man they called the Dragon of Albania. The victory at Albulena remains one of the most spectacular feats of arms in the medieval world, a reminder that even when the odds are 10 to 1, the outcome is never written until the final horn is blown.